Well, thank you, everyone, and we're just going to start up with our featured speakers for the afternoon, Barbara Kline Pope and Dietram as well. And I have the pleasure of introducing Barbara again. I spoke earlier, but for those of you who weren't here, let me run through her titles again. She's Executive Director for Communication for the National Academies and Executive Director of the National Academies Press. She's also publisher for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And as we said earlier, she's shaped the discourse in scholarly communication for the last decade, and she shaped this program as well. She joined us in the fall, and she walked the teams through building a communication plan, as we discussed at the end in a conference last fall. And now we've sort of baked that into the program this year, and as we'll talk about a little bit after they speak about the new call, that's an element of our new proposal as well. So, and with that, Laura will introduce our other speaker.
We're also pleased to be joined by Dietram Scheufele. He's the John E. Ross Professor in Science Communication and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and in the Morgridge Institute for Research. Dietram has been a tenured faculty member at Cornell, a fellow at Harvard, and has consulting experience working for PBS, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. His publications have been listed by the Web of Science as being among the 1% most cited articles in the field of general social science. His research includes work on the public and political interfaces of emerging science and the role of emerging modes of communication in democratic decision-making. Please join me in welcoming our featured speakers, Barbara Kline Pope and Dietram Scheufele.
So, well,
that was me.
That was you? Thank you so much for having us this afternoon. As Peter said, I was here last year helping you think about effective and evidence-based communication. And one of the things that I hope I left people with was that we need to collaborate, we practitioners need to collaborate with social science researchers rather than use our own intuition when we go to communicate. And happily, I have taken my own advice this year and brought along one of my favorite social science researchers, Dietram Scheufele. So, and based on what I've learned from you, I know that credibility is bestowed by the audience. We don't exude credibility. You decide if we're credible. So what else besides that introduction, which I didn't know was going to be quite that introduction, do they need to know to make sure that you are both trustworthy and competent, which are the two things that go into credibility?
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have any good convincing pieces other than, and Barbara pointed out to me that I usually, first thing I say about myself is that I'm German, and that as if that makes a difference. The problem is that I'm only German genetically, but I don't have any of the traits that actually would help, like being on time or preparing for things well, as Barbara knows. So I almost was late today because I didn't realize I was crossing time zones driving from Madison, and was actually would lose an hour along the way. So I'm really happy to be here. I've actually never been on the Purdue campus, so thank you for having us. And Barbara, anything else before we get started?
And you can see, if we're on a team and you're always late, for me, being on time is 20 minutes early.
That is correct.
So, but we do collaborate a lot. We've known each other for a really long time, and we're going to do this presentation together. It's going to be kind of back and forth rather than 20 minutes and 20 minutes. And we easily bleed into each other's, expertise levels. I do a little bit of research in coordination with people like Dietram. And Dietram, of course, is thinking a lot about the practical aspects of communication because you want research to practice, and we want the research that's going to help us as well. So we've been working on that. So Dietram, you want to take us through what we're going to do?
Sure, and I in many ways I have to say, for the research and practice piece, I've learned probably more about what relevant research questions are and ways to guide my own research program by working with practitioners and running into barriers of doing translational work myself. So really quickly, the four things we want to talk about, and I know you've talked about this a little bit this morning, why are we in a unique and maybe novel kind of infrastructure when it comes to the science and society interface? And then we want to spend a lot of time actually destroying or at least addressing some myths that are out there about good science or effective science communication, and talk then based on those myths that are true or not true about some of the concrete steps, and leave you hopefully also with some useful advice on what that means. But let me start really quickly talking about the challenges for the science and society interface. And I saw on one of your flyers you're talking, and also this morning you were talking, or this afternoon, about wicked problems, right? So these problems, of course, that require interdisciplinary solutions to a degree. That's one half, but the other half is also that they don't have a solution. They have multiple solutions, all of which require trade-offs. And they're really representative of modern science. The human gene editing being a great example. CRISPR-Cas9 came up earlier. Science that is highly complex because it's interdisciplinary. Most of us did not learn that science in school, meaning we have to pick it up as we go through our lives as new technologies emerge. And we have to pick it up really quickly. By the time nanotechnology, or by the time most people realized what nanotechnology is, we already had 2,000 products on the consumer end market. So the bench to bedside transition is faster than we've seen for most other technologies. And then the last one, and this really kind of, again, echoes that idea of wicked problems, a lot of the questions that are raised by this modern science don't have technical answers. The questions are not even technical in nature. They're in fact ethical, social, legal, and very often the ELSI, ethical, legal, social implications acronym is used for that. The second part that's really tricky, so we have this fast-moving, complex science with questions that don't have technical answers. Well, the people who have helped us translate that complex science are people who are rapidly going away. We're losing our science journalists. The small-sized papers have laid them off a long time ago. Now we're losing them in the large papers. The Rig Weisses at the Washington Post, the Barnaby Faders at the New York Times, the Miles O'Brien and other people at CNN, Ken Weiss at the LA Times, and then Dan Bergano, who of course was one of the last people standing at USA Today, who went away. Now these are all older white guys, so that may not be necessarily all bad in certain ways. There's certainly the old guard, and again, these are all unbelievably good science journalists, but it does leave us without those translators that take highly complex science and translate them into 300 words or less that I can understand at the breakfast table without having scientific expertise. As a result, and that font was bigger at some point in the original version, as a result, we had Ralph Cicerone, former president of the National Academies, saying, look, you guys need to step up. You guys, being scientists, need to step up and fill that void. We had Alan Leshner now infamously talk about this important, or this need to engage the public, not just us telling them what the science is, but this honest bidirectional dialogue that he talked about, not just about the promise, but also about the perils. And then Janet Napolitano, who of course was Secretary of Homeland Defense and is now president of the UC system, has talked about the need for researchers to be front and center, not just in the scientific debates, but the political debates surrounding some of that wicked science. And of course, our initial reaction very often as scientists is to blame the audience and saying they're uninformed, they have a whole bunch of problems, but there's a few real pitfalls to that.
And I have a story to tell about that. So we publish about 250 studies a year at the National Academies. One of the things that we do, of course, is sticky issues in science, and I talked about that earlier today. Climate change, GMOs, nuclear power, evolution. So can't think of many more of these sticky issues that we have to deal with. So the Council of the National Academy of Sciences, of course, some of the smartest people in the world, get very frustrated and had been very frustrated about the public not believing the scientific community or not listening to the scientific community. And so it was 2010, and I was going to their meetings, and they were talking again about how frustrated they were about climate change. And there has been a lot of work on climate change since then, but back then they were very frustrated about that, about science topics, and about why the public will not accept that climate change is real and it's human-induced, et cetera, et cetera. So they would say, nobody is listening to us, nobody's listening to the facts, and then they would get kind of all global on us and say, and no one trusts science, no one respects science. I say that when they would say no one respects science, I'd say that's kind of the Rodney Dangerfield aspect of how they were feeling at the time. And so at that point, I went and looked at the polls and showed them that there is great public confidence in science. There's great trust in science. But we're talking about overall science. But back then, I wasn't really into the scientific literature and didn't really know that. I said, well, look, so the scientific community has public confidence, and the blue is a great deal of confidence, the red is some confidence, just under the military. And all these other people, have less confidence in the public. So then I also show them this data, which is Harris poll data, 32 years of data for perceptions of great prestige among the public on different occupations. And this is in order of highest prestige. And so you can see here when firefighters after 9/11 actually came into the poll, they had very great prestige. And in 2009 is the last year that Harris actually did this poll. Then next we have scientists, doctors, nurses, all way up there. They're all kind of neck and neck. Now this chart gets really messy. I'm just going to very quickly go down through it so that you can see how many other occupations have lower prestige in the public's mind than scientists and doctors. So they said, okay, well, given this data, why don't people understand climate change? Why don't they know that GMOs are widely recognized as safe? Why don't they accept evolution? What is the problem with these people? And so the next time I went into the meeting, I went in with a big pile of papers, some of them Dietram's, and said, there's a scholarship behind this, and I think there are people out there in the social science community who can help us understand this, and they're part of your community. We just need to turn to the social science and see what we can learn from them. So over the years, over the next 2 years, we brought in social scientists to talk about the cognitive underpinnings of people's perceptions about science, and also the political and the environment, the political and social environment where people actually get their messages. We learned a lot from them. And some prominent members of the NAS said, why don't we do a colloquium series on the science of science communication so that it's not just us learning this information, but we can spread this out to the scientific community, we can spread it out to practitioners. And so they hatched this idea. Dietram was one of the organizers. We had 2 of them so far. Dr. Cicerone is president of the NAS. Baruch Fischoff you saw him in another slide. He's the father of decision science. Alan Leshner, former CEO of AAAS, and Barbara Shaw, who was our vice president at the time and is head of Dean of Faculty at WashU, and then staff. So I want to show you a 1-minute video, or 1.5-minute video, that really tells you very quickly the reasons for the Sackler Colloquium, and then also sets the stage for the rest of the presentation.
We use the scientific method to understand how the natural world works. We generate hypotheses. We observe, we measure, we analyze, we replicate. Yet, when it comes to communicating the meaning and significance of our discoveries, why do we so often use our intuition instead of science? The stakes are too high to rely on our hunches. Just think of all the critical topics in science that suffer from ineffective communication. It doesn't have to be this way. Social, behavioral, and decision scientists have made great progress in understanding how communication fails and succeeds. We should be as scientific about communication as about the science we are communicating. The Sackler Colloquia on the Science of Science Communication, where scientists and communication professionals come together to write a better future for communicating science.
And so after we had all of these different interactions with social scientists and got to understand this a little bit better, we really started to stop blaming the disconnect in ineffective communication on others and started to be more critical of ourselves, knowing that we needed to understand our audiences better. And one of the main takeaways from all of this was that the public and other audiences accepting the scientific consensus is not necessarily about the facts. And Dietram is going to tell us why.
Yeah, and I mean, you already heard that one of our initial, and when I say our, I really mean all of us, initial instincts is to say, well, it's a lack of trust, right? And then we see that it's not a lack of trust. But one of the biggest intuitions, or the most persistent intuitions that turns out to be wrong, is what some people have called the knowledge deficit model, or the familiarity hypothesis. So this idea that if people only knew more, they would make better decisions about the science. By better, we mean more pro-science decisions. And so that ultimately the conclusion, of course, then is, well, what effective science communication is ultimately education. It's public education about science. And ultimately that if they're more educated, they're going to be more positive, they're going to be more supportive of science. The problem with that is, and I put a bit unfairly Alan Alda here because of the Alan Alda Institute, but the reason I put him here is not because they're not doing good work, but because I think we as a community very often look for these saviors, right, that will help us do exactly something that actually is much more complicated, because the data doesn't support this idea that there's a positive link between people knowing more and being more supportive of science. In fact, we know from decades of research in political psychology and elsewhere this idea of motivated reasoning, right? And as here's the first reference to me being German, I'm always surprised how quick the Hitler comparisons come out in this country, right? So Obama was Hitler because of Obamacare, and Bush 43 was Hitler because of his stance on education and standardized testing. Neither one of these stances should qualify you as being called a dictator. But of course, all of these things, what motivated reasoning means, the exact same things, facts mean different things to different people. Why? Because of confirmation biases. If I put 10 facts in front of you, then you will weigh more heavily those facts that fit your prior beliefs. I do the same thing. We all do. And you discount those facts that don't fit your prior beliefs. That's how we all defend our viewpoints. It's called biased assimilation. We assimilate basically reality in a somewhat biased fashion into what we already believe. In politics, that's one thing. In science, that's a real problem, because the exact same facts scientifically mean different things to different people, are interpreted differently by different audiences. And Wisconsin, of course, being in recovering from one of the bigger budget battles that we've had in a while, $250 million, being cut from the state, from the university budget, partly for bioenergy, which nobody understood at Wisconsin. Why would we cut in this big investment in bioenergy that's so great for the state's economy? Well, it depends on who you ask. We actually had a survey in the field in Wisconsin with the Corn Growers Association, where we asked on the x-axis the information intake, and this is just simplified bivariate here, is obviously much more complicated statistical models. And then here on the y, you basically see, do they see a positive effect on the state's economy or negative effect below zero? So if Democrats get more information, TV or newspapers doesn't really matter. They see more positive effects on the state's economy. For Republicans, exactly the opposite. So the more facts you put in front of them, the further they move apart. Neither one of them is right or wrong. They simply both engage in the exact same type of motivated reasoning, meaning I put facts in front of you, you're the ones that fit your priors, you weigh more heavily, and the other ones you weigh less heavily. Lots of indication, or lots of similar data. Dan Kahan, who you just saw on one of the slides, has shown this really nicely around cultural values and so on. But basically putting the final nail in the coffin of what some people have called the zombie of science communication, that thing that will not die. And that is the idea that if we just give people knowledge, they will make better decisions. And we know now more and more that that's not true. Barbara also spoke how much more important potentially the trust that the audience has into communicators. Lots of research about that with children, for instance, psychology, learning, that shows that children trust a warm, friendly non-expert much more than they trust a non-friendly expert. So the person actually knows what he's talking about, or she is not trusted as much as the person who just appears warm. Susan Fisk was nice enough to do a little bit of a data collection for one of the Sackler colloquia, a psychologist at Princeton, where she plotted, and I think this is circled here very nicely, she plotted basically, or she had people evaluate different professions based on competence and warmth. And of course, scientists are all the way out on competence. That's great. The problem is they're not perceived to be particularly warm. So again, as a source, and as a source that's being trusted for information, especially for highly contentious questions, right? Are we going to edit the genome of human embryos, for instance, at some point? And do we trust the people who are doing that, who are telling us that it will all be fine? And she's shown very, very nicely that that warmth element is something that is just crucially important. The professors are scoring slightly higher here. Ultimately, where that leaves us is really at a weird interface, where on the one hand we have people like Larry Page, who at some point threw a conversational grenade into a meeting of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, when it was out on the West Coast in 2007, and said, you guys have a marketing problem, period. You don't do as good a job talking about all the stuff that you do as we do in selling, I don't know, Diet Pepsi or whatever else. And you need to get involved in these things. But I think Baruch, who was one of the co-organizers, Baruch Fischoff of the Sacklers, also threw out a really important cautionary note, and that is, look, if you engage in advocacy, meaning you really cross that line, you may lose key trust that you will need down the road when the next issue comes along. So that line between the two pictures is really that very fine line between effective communication and going over into advocacy. And I think the next one, I'm turning it back over to you, and that's not true. That's still me. Clearly we did not rehearse this enough.
I did. I don't know about you.
Nice. Thank you. That's what's that? Yeah, exactly. No. So the second myth that is actually an important one, because it also is one that keeps coming up, is this idea that if we really want to have a good debate about issues like gene editing or anything else, people need to start basically using the same framework that scientists are using. And you can, in your heads already, you can see 1,000 reasons why that's probably wrong, but I want to give you a few more systematic ones. This is the most important one. This is us for almost everything that we do. Meaning, we behave in what people in cognitive science or in psychology call cognitive misers. Right? We use as little information as we can possibly use for most decisions. Every single person you've met today, you've actually made a judgment if they're going to stab you or mug you or something, if they're dangerous. You've made that judgment. You just didn't realize you made that judgment, but you did. You chose what you're going to wear, all these things, and you made all those decisions. You've already judged me in some way, shape, or form based on the tie that I'm wearing or whatever else, meaning you use a few pieces of information and you make a judgment. We all do, all the time. Some people call it satisficing, rather that sounds a bit more positive, meaning we're using as much information as we think we need, rather than as little as possible. But ultimately, and this is a term that comes straight out of the campaigning literature, that's rational. We have to do all these things. We have to take our children to daycare. We have to make decisions about what to buy, what to wear, what to eat. We need to judge other people all the time. And it doesn't work if we collect all available information, if we make careful, rational decisions. So instead, we rely on shortcuts. We rely on heuristics. We know this from decades of research. And when I mean we, I mean us as scientists as well. When I make a judgment about climate change, I haven't read the primary literature. I haven't. I trust that scientists are doing a good job. I believe that there's certain good peer-reviewed journals, and if it's in there, I believe it. Right? I constantly rely on heuristics. Even I, as an academic, rely on heuristics when I judge other people's work. So one really important example of a heuristic is actually cultivation. And cultivation basically says that a lot of the 325 million Americans, their exposure to most new technologies doesn't come from the New York Times or from the Washington Post or even their local paper or a website. It comes from entertainment media. Nanotechnology got its first mentions in Terminator 3. Who knows what a theoretical physicist does? Well, nobody, and nobody has ever seen one at work, but most people have seen Sheldon Cooper at some point, playing one on TV, literally, and then, of course, our image of scientists are heavily, heavily shaped by how they're portrayed. So I teach a class of about 200 undergrads from 4 different colleges at Wisconsin called Science, Media, and Society. And so these are kids they're not kids. They're young adults who work in labs, who are pre-med, who know what a university and what a scientist looks like. As an attendance quiz, I asked them in 1 week to give me 5 terms that they think describe a scientist. And so they just have to write in 5 terms. I take them, I wordle them together, and this is what comes out. That person is, of course, male, old, has a lab coat, glasses, weird hair, straight from Back to the Future. Right? These are, even our students at top research universities end up having this exact same entertainment image of what a scientist looks like. Not the person who's standing lecturing them or who they're working with in a lab, but the image that comes out of entertainment media. And Barbara will tell you how that mechanism can really be used in an applied way.
So knowing this research and knowing that people get their worldview from popular culture, Ralph Cicerone, the president of the National Academy of Sciences until very recently, decided that it would be a really good investment for us to come up with a program to try to get better portrayals of scientists in film and TV and more realistic science into film and TV. And that would, getting those 325 million people this way instead of, in other ways. So in 2008, we launched this program, still going on very, very strong. We've done thousands of consultations. And so what we do, we have an office in LA, and writers and directors and producers call us and say, I've got this storyline, I've got this set design, it has to do with science. And at first when they would call us, they say, I need a scientist, and they would talk about the biology and the chemistry and the physics and everything else. We say, no, you need 5 scientists, you need a think tank. And so we do that. We also do events where we're trying not to just give consultations on specific things that are already done, but to try to inspire these writers to write scripts that have science at their core. And for example, Kenneth Branagh, who was the director for Thor, we matched him up with Sean M. Carroll, the physicist at Caltech. And Natalie Portman's character was supposed to be a nurse based on the graphic novel on which this movie is based. And Sean Carroll talked him into making her a physicist, a gorgeous woman physicist. So we like that. Okay. Cheating? No. Come on. Lisa Randall. Do you know Lisa Randall? She's a real physicist. She looks like that.
So the third myth that I think is very persistent and keeps sticking around is the idea that science communication is really about us talking and then people will listen, right? I mean, and that's what we do in lecture halls. But of course, in reality, it doesn't work out that way. I just put together here 3 really quick models that basically is how science communication is developed. The first one is clearly this communication of science, this knowledge deficit. I know something, you need to know it, I'm telling you, in the old lecture hall model. And then Alan Leshner came along and really challenged the field, and I think rightfully so, and said, look, you need this honest bidirectional dialogue. We talk about science, but if we're honest, if we do science on tap, if we do all these town hall meetings, ultimately we still have control over the message, right? It's still us organizing them. And there's a scientist, and he or she gives a talk, and there's beer, and then afterwards there's a Q&A to highly interested audiences. The reality, though, is this, and that is most debates, if that's gene editing, if that's climate change, if that's GMOs, really happen in a large societal setting where science is just one of many voices, and very often it's not a voice not a very loud voice. So figuring out how science can have a footprint in large political debates is increasingly important when it comes to, we heard this morning or this afternoon, rather, regulatory issues surrounding CRISPR-Cas9 or whatever else. So this idea that people are just waiting for us to speak as the sage on the stage, as some people have talked about, is not very realistic. In fact, we're very often out-communicated. A lot of my work deals with framing, so the idea that the exact same piece of information can be presented in very different ways, and that the mode of presentation matters. This was one of the most successful communication campaigns about science, and the beauty is it has absolutely 0 information in it, yet you immediately know what it's meant to say. The genetically frosted fakes, Tony the Frankentiger, Frankenfood. I give you 1 term, I don't give you information. I'm not giving you a convincing message. I'm not persuading you. All I'm telling you is a term. And all of a sudden, you're connecting genetically modified organisms to a mental shelf that says there's scientists putting stuff together that doesn't belong together. Down the road, we're going to lose control over this, and there are going to be undesirable outcomes. And I've said all of this with one term, frankenfood. That's why it was so brilliant, and that's why it was so effective. And of course, it bleeds over into media coverage, where frankenfood is now a pretty well-established frame. All goes back to research, actually really elegant research, one of the studies that I wish I'd done in the 50s, but I didn't clearly. Neither did Daniel Kahneman, but he used it effectively enough to win a Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for his work. Tversky had passed on by that time. And he basically said, look, everything we look at depends on our frame of reference. So I can take the exact same information and offer one frame of reference or another one. This was the study that they relied on, the so-called broken B stimulus. That could be a 1 and a 3, or it could be a B, right? Difficult to tell. Well, it can make it very easy for you by putting you into experimental group 1 and embedding it in a set of letters, and all of a sudden this is a letter to you. There's just no other way of interpreting this. Well, if you're in the other group, there is, because now all of a sudden I'm showing you a different sequence. So I can take, this is science, right? This is gene editing, which could be about killing unborn life, or it could be about curing genetically transmitted diseases. Well, it depends on how I frame it for you. And the problem with framing, of course, is that very often we treat it as a persuasive tool. So we're saying, well, frankenfood, that's unethical. We shouldn't do that. It's spinning science. But it's not spinning science. Framing is something that we all do all the time. It's actually a way that helps the Rick Weisses and the Barnaby Faders and all these science writers to connect highly complex science to a mental shelf that we have. So framing, frankenfood works because it makes it easy for me. I know exactly what your argument is in one headline. It tells me why an issue is important, which for GM we've never delivered on, right? We've never really offered a really good value proposition that if somebody says this is unnatural, I don't want it in my body, my answer has never been a really good one. There's golden rice, okay, fine, but there's, our first product was Flavor Saver tomatoes. And keeping a tomato that doesn't taste so good in the first place in my fridge for 8 weeks is just not something that has addressed any of my problems in a very effective way. And it means framing, well-framed messages are messages that make them easy for us to process. If I see a bunch of blank stares, if I say something, I'm going to try a different frame, a different metaphor, a different way of fitting it into a mental shelf that you have or that we both share. Most importantly, there's no such thing as an unframed message. So the idea that there's a neutral message that we could have is naive. A piece in science does not get published until it's transformational, until it's new, novel, has broad impact. An NSF grant is not accepted until it has broader impacts and intellectual merit and touches on all the things that are in the call for proposals. So even in science, every message is to some degree framed, because otherwise we can't actually process it effectively. And Barbara has a whole bunch of examples, I think, of how that plays out in practice.
I do, but I'm going to cover one today, just one. So in 2007, I met Matt Nisbet, who's a professor of science communication. I think he's now at Northeastern. But he was at American University at that time and went to AAAS and went and listened to him talk about framing. And right after that, we were going to get started on the Science, Evolution, and Creationism document. And instead of me just being the dissemination piece of this, I was actually on the staff that was creating this from the very beginning. So we put all of the communication work at the very beginning of this and throughout the entire project. And so I'm going to use this as an example for a number of things. But for framing, this is the third in a series on this topic. And we thought, okay, we have to do a third one of these now because intelligent design was coming along. We had to try to explain that evolution should be taught in the science classroom, creationism should not. Why is this still a problem? And so instead of just doing the same thing over again, like screaming what you want in a foreign country, we wanted to make sure that we were using the framing research and that we were really understanding our audiences. And so what we did with this is we used the framing research, and then we did our own research. So we did focus groups, we did a survey, and really figured out what people were thinking about. And we were not going after the people where there is a true conflict between religion and science, and that's, you know, the literal reading of the Bible. So we sort of set that group aside. We're not going after the people who already accepted evolution. We're going after the wobbly middle who would think maybe evolution's okay, but this intelligent design thing sounds okay to me. So we're trying to figure out where they were and trying to reach them there. And so what we found from all of that research was that people thought that their religion was going to conflict with accepting evolution. And so when you have that kind of decision, it's, well, if I accept evolution, I'm going to hell. You know, so that's pretty risky. But all but evangelicals don't have that conflict. But they didn't know they didn't have that conflict. And so at the very beginning of this, we decided that we were going to explain that science and religion are different ways of looking at the world, and that we would include statements by religious leaders to prove it. That here is the Pope saying it's okay to accept evolution. The other thing that we learned, very surprisingly, is that explaining that it's illegal to teach creationism in a public classroom, in a science classroom, in the focus groups, when we said that, they got their backs all up and got very upset about it and said, you know, I don't think the legal system should be conflicting or even a part of my school system. So we knew we shouldn't start with that conversation. We did talk about it. We have excerpts from court cases in there, but we did not talk about that specifically. We also went into this knowing the literature in psychology, and that we all know that if you insult your audience, they'll shut down and not listen to you. And so we made sure that while we were very clear about the science and evolution, and that's what's supposed to be taught in the classroom, we were not saying that, and religion doesn't have a place in this world. We were saying there are two different ways of looking at the world. And this document was accepted and used in science classrooms, and our audiences for this were teachers, school boards, lawyers, because this is also used, you know, in a court. The last version was used in the courts. So we used the research in order to actually be successful with this particular document. It's been downloaded 150,000 times. We have many, many printed copies out there, so it's done very well. The rest of this is mine, isn't it?
I think it
Until
is.
the end. Okay. So, well, I'm not going to do a communication workshop. Peter asked that I cover the elements of a communication plan so that you can use that as you're working on your proposals. And then also I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts that we look for. Because when we talk about a communication plan, and I'm going to use this same booklet, this is a little booklet, as an example. So in any communication plan, in anything that you're planning, and the things that we talked about this afternoon at the 1 o'clock session, is that you need to know what you're trying to accomplish. So for science, evolution, and creationism, before we put pen to paper for this was back in 2007, so we're still writing, right? No. Before we put pen to paper, we were really trying to figure out what we wanted to accomplish from this book. So the communication starts at the very beginning. And our objectives for this was to inform the conversation and to be respectful about it. Our audiences, I said the audiences were teachers and other people in the education world, lawyers, business leaders. Anytime you are working on a communication plan, this is incredibly important. And the talk today really was all about understanding your audience. So we really need to make sure that you know your audience. There's lots of research on audiences on certain topics. You can go and do that. But also, if you have the resources, it's really good to try to talk to these audiences through in-depth interviews, focus groups, surveys, whatever you can do. But you do need to make sure, and Dietram and I were talking about this, if you're going to do research, it needs to be done right. Because if you do research incorrectly and you don't have the right survey methodology, you're going to get wrong answers, and then you're going to go forward, you know, thinking that your audiences have one set of information in their heads when they have another. Then on messages, we worked very hard on this, and in fact, we wrote messages for this particular document, and then we tested them when we tested them on the web. So you want to make sure you're thinking about that. And then the product piece of your communication plan is, how should we package the information that we want to use to connect with our audiences? And so for this one, we had a 128-page book, and then we had a very short document. We did not do a video for this, but you really need to think about, and one of the other groups talked about videos. So what are the ways in which your audiences like to receive their information? And for all of these, you're always going back to your audience. What are your objectives and what is your audience? Channels. How are you going to reach that audience? It's incredibly important. And in fact, when you're thinking about your audiences, you can think about how important they are on one dimension, and then you can also think about how easy they are to reach. Because if you can't reach them, and they're important, you're going to spend all your money trying to reach them and never do it. So as you're thinking about your audiences and plot them out in your particular proposals. Evaluation is very important. We talked about that at the 1 o'clock session as well. Really trying to figure out, did you meet your objectives? And how far did you get in meeting your objectives? And using outputs as well as outcomes to figure that out. And then the resources. How much money do you have? How much time, how much effort do you have to put forward for this communication? For science, evolution, and creationism, I will be very honest and say we spent $150,000 on that audience research. So, but there's a lot at stake here, right? Teaching evolution in the science classroom. So I think it was worth it because in the end, this was well accepted both by the scientific community. Every February is Evolution Day and with a clergy letter project, and there are churches throughout the nation who are talking about this, and the downloads of this spike on that date, on that Sunday every year. Am I running out of time? Okay, anyway, so research should infuse all of this. So I want to talk a little bit very quickly about impact and the kinds of impacts that we look for at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And these are in order of kind of narrow to very broad. And this might help you think about what kinds of impacts you might want with your proposals. So in legislation and regulation, what we're trying to do with the academies is influence policy, not influence, we never influence, to inform policymakers that will lead to legislation or regulation. And for Rising Above the Gathering Storm, this report was actually the base for building the America Competes Act. And then for a regulation, an example is our book on fuel economy for cars, and that actually feeds into an environmental regulation. For government policy or programs, my favorite one is the one on the right. This is Chimpanzees and Biomedical Research. It was run by my husband. This changed completely how research is being conducted in all disease models except for one. And so this committee figured out that, through evidence, that chimps were not needed in all but one disease model for hepatitis C. And so all the chimps were being retired. We also try to affect a discipline or a community. And in forensic science, this particular report affected this discipline of forensic science in a way that we didn't even expect. It was really profound. We also are interested in affecting individual or student knowledge. How people learn has affected about 150,000 students because this is used in classrooms around the nation. And we rarely, have an impact, a broad society impact, but these books on science education have led to what students need to learn in the science classroom. So we feel like we've really done a great job of influencing that. Also in 1999 through To Err is Human, we sounded the alarm of medical errors. And since then, we've had a lot of progress in that area in the medical community because of that. I'm going to run through this real quickly. So we're not able to draw a straight line from dissemination to impact. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to measure. We think that the level of dissemination and the level of impact are probably positively correlated, but it's very difficult to measure. But at the very, very elementary level, dissemination is absolutely necessary for impact. Somebody has to know about your work in order for you to be able to influence that impact that you want. And I'm going to stop there and have you sum up and skip this piece. We can go back to it in Q&A.
That sounds good. And actually, I think the final piece is just a cheat sheet almost for takeaways, and a lot of which Barbara and hopefully I, to some degree, have talked about. Things to do in order to have an effective set of communication. One, you need to know what your objectives are. You need to know your audience. We talked about this. And one of our first myths that we talked about is, in most cases, your audience is not at fault. In most cases, it's us, right? And because we think they're lacking trust or whatever else it may be, and very often research tells us that that's not the case. And very often, you don't even need new research because there is actually lots of research out there. There's, for example, 2 colloquium issues, special issues of PNAS, the Proceeding of the National Academies, on the science of science communication. There is, I think it went in review today, and in our C report on the science of science communication, that once it's been revised based on the reviews, will come out and actually summarize a lot of this research. A lot of my career has been spent working with engineers, with bench scientists on collaborative projects, on nuclear physics, on GMOs, on stem cell research, on gene editing. And hopefully they've learned something from what I've contributed, but I've certainly learned a lot from them. But that's the way for bench scientists very often to actually tap the expertise at your institution. And then one of the most important ones, I think, is, and this goes back to the framing idea, how you talk about the science matters. Kathleen Hall Jamieson at Penn, for example, talks about the idea that maybe herd immunity is not a really good term. The idea that we all follow a herd like sheep, that there may be something called community immunity. That's a much better idea. And that thinking early on about terminology that to us makes total sense, but that to 325 million Americans sounds very, very different when they hear it, I think is something. And she's a rhetorician by training, so certainly sensitized to that. And then, of course, all the priors that we all use all the time, right? That liberals and conservatives, that people of certain cultural values look at the exact same information very differently. And then subtlety is one important one, which is why we put this up. Most importantly, it is a scientific problem. How to bridge the science-public divide is not a problem of intuition, of feeling, of whatever else. It's a scientific problem. That one that requires scientific answers and that requires data. And so Barbara alluded to this. I just want to reiterate it. Bad data is worse very often than no data. Data that gives you confidence in the wrong direction is actually much more problematic than if you know you're flying blind and are intuiting it. So the last thing is just to increase our hopefully perception of transparency and therefore competence and everything else that comes with it, and warmth. I think ultimately here the funding sources that's my deficit here. The funding sources for our work, and I think we're ready for the Q&A. Thank you so much for having us again.
Jim Mullins from the libraries here at Purdue. About 10 years ago, Purdue started a program called the Science Journalist Laureate Program. And it was to recognize science writers who communicated the results of research to the public. Many of the people that you talked about were part of the Science Laureate Program. And the whole intent was that to understand how to transmit the results of science through journalism into the public domain. And it was sponsored by the College of Science and the libraries. And the first couple of years, and Maura Gunn, who is the Tech Nation, the host of Tech Nation on PBS, or NPR, was the catalyst for this. And on one of the panels, we had a scientist, we had a journalist, and we had me. And I don't know why I was there, but I was there. And we were talking about transmitting and how to transmit the concepts that are discovered within science, and then how it's misinterpreted to the public. And so for an example, I said, you might see something reported in the New England Journal of Medicine that is an advance where they've identified some minor point in helping to identify some aspect that will help solve a cancer issue, one of the cancer. But then you see it the next time on NPR or something like this, and they're describing it but simplifying it. But then you finally see it on the Today Show, and it's like there's a cure for cancer that's been discovered. It's this extrapolation. And the point that I was making was, this is when the public gets skeptical, because you can only hear so many times that there's been a cure for cancer found, because it's been misrepresented to the public, simplified in the representation to the public. And I think that's one of the reasons why the general public starts having some, you can't go to the checkout line and see every week that there's been some new discovery in solving some major disease and have any continued belief that there is validity in this. I'd like to.
And that perception among the public is there. I just did some research with the Frameworks Institute on the perception of the behavioral and social sciences in the public world. And in that, they ask about the general sciences, and one of the main takeaways from that, actually it was qualitative research on that piece of it, was that they think scientists are fickle. And so that's one of the issues that then we took into account as we're framing the messages around the human benefits of the behavioral and social sciences, because that's the project that we're working on. And so we know that the public does really think that. Because it's drink coffee one day, don't drink coffee the next day. It does exist. Is there any?
No, I think that's actually, so this is something that came up in the NRC Committee on the Science of Science Communication as well. Because of course the self-correcting nature of science is an important thing to communicate in many ways, right? That we do prove each other wrong every so often, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think a second element of what you mentioned is the idea of hype, that we're over-promising even internally, and then that by the time it reaches NBC or the Today Show, it's really over-promised. But I think there is a second element to that that I want to highlight, and Rick Weiss, who was up here, who I think was one of our best science writers for a long time, challenged me at some point at a AAAS panel and said, look, our job is actually not to convey your science. Our job is to get an audience to pay attention to things and to sell newspapers. And so you need to stop treating us as if we're your informational outreach arm. And he didn't quite put it that bluntly or that flippantly, but basically that's what he was saying, and he's absolutely right. In a commercial media system, his job is to get eyeballs on an article and highlight in that article, and he wrote that infamous headline at the time, or his editor did, that BT corn was killing the Bambi of butterflies, right? I mean, great headline, and I'm sorry, I want to read this story, and it's an interesting story. But of course, it also suggests a certain interpretation about BT corn and GM, that's problematic. But I think that second element, our expectation to at a media system, even for traditional media, were unrealistic. For a new media system where Facebook curates feeds that are based on personal preference and a whole bunch of other things, that is out the window anyway. So we can talk about that in a...
And scientists also talk about the fact that some of that hype starts with the university PR office. Probably shouldn't say this in this group, but that does happen. So then by the time you get to where you are on the Today Show, it's really been hyped.
Cold fusion is a good example.
Yep.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Hi, I'm Bert Chapman from the libraries. In your Science, Evolution, and Creationism project, to what extent did you engage with evangelical organizations like the National Association for Evangelicals, evangelical K-12 educational institutions, and evangelical higher educational institutions like the Coalition for Christian Colleges and Universities?
We did not talk directly with them. What we did have in the Q&A in the back was written by a physicist. It was our intern who was a physicist PhD from the University of Maryland, who was an evangelical and was brought up in that world. And so we had some input.
Do they still adhere to that tradition? There are a lot of people who may be brought up in a particular religious tradition who, for whatever reason, no longer adhere adhere to
She-
it. Because if,
well,
if
she-
this
yeah.
person did not adhere to it anymore, they would have zero credibility with the evangelical community.
She was really on the edge on that. And like I said, we were not necessarily spending our resources on the evangelical community because we knew that they'd be tough to move.
Hi, Jerry Scheufele from AggieCon. So you began, or early on in your presentation, you had the slide of the amazing disappearing print journalists. And I think that's a reality, for sure. And most of the data seem to suggest that reading is on a decline, in this country at least. And many of us are comfortable communicating and writing, and our primary means of communicating with each other remains writing. But if we're writing and no one's reading, or fewer people are reading, how do we retool ourselves to communicate through new means and new media, where the word is, or the written word is perhaps not the primary part of the message that we want to deliver?
So I'm going
Go
to
ahead.
throw two things out, and then Barbara can chime in. One is I'm not so sure that the written word is as much on the decline as it may seem to some people. I definitely agree with you that visual, moving images, and so on and so forth are important, especially for certain demographics. But a lot of the algorithm-based communication that a Facebook, that a Google, that a whole bunch of other distribution channels rely on are still very much written, just because visual is so difficult to do. I mean, for Google image searches and so on and so forth. So I think that's part of the problem. I think that raises a second issue, and that I think is the most important one. I think it's the channel or the type of if it's visual or textual is much less important than the reach. And I think that's where we have our real problem, right? The idea that I'm living in, and Chantal Enger and I just wrote about this, in a world where basically we've increased selectivity from the bottom up and from the top down. From the bottom up, it's easier for me than ever before to pre-select what I want to see. If I don't want to see a certain article or a certain type of content, I can pre-select that out with my news aggregator, with what I click on, with everything else. I can set up exactly in my Feedly or my Flipbook or whatever else what I see, who I follow on Twitter and so on. At the same time, of course, that's the holy grail for media organizations, right? To feed me exactly what I want to see. And I tell my students all the time, I don't care about baseball. I didn't grow up in this country. I follow soccer, which nobody in this country understands, right? Why would you ever give me a New York Times front page that has baseball? Because I'm going to move. I'm going to go away from your advertising environment. It makes no sense. So what Facebook does, what Google does, what all news organizations do is tailoring news toward my priors. So we have two pressures that both basically say, I'm going to thin you, I'm going to make your diet pure, more and more pure toward what you already like. If you don't like science, you're going to get less and less science. And I'm going to have a harder and harder time reaching you with science, because you went through a local paper and you ran into that article that Rick Weiss wrote and that was syndicated in the local paper about nanotech. Now I don't see that anymore, because I've self-selected out, because the algorithm tells them I don't want it and I tell them I don't want it. So I think our problem is reach. And that's where social media and so on will be much more important in terms of getting into networks that we typically don't get into, and reaching channels. That's for me is.
Do you want to mention incidental exposure?
Yeah, I mean that's.
From a practical, he's a researcher, and then I bring it down to incidental exposure. So go ahead.
No, the one thing is, and we actually did a study where we showed that scientists having a digital media footprint is not just one that helps with them having a public impact, but it also helps within the ivory tower in terms of the most productive scientists that we had in our samples when we surveyed them are also the ones who have the most the highest digital media footprint, meaning they're on Twitter, they're actually publicizing their work. So I'll let you do that, since I didn't take your point.
And so if you want to reach people who are in this very narrow bandwidth of content, and they're not going to see what you have, but you know that they're going to be interested, you might have to actually go into their narrow bandwidth somehow and frame what you want to say so that it actually ends up in their feed.
Yeah.
So that's called, in the research literature, incidental exposure.
I actually think we are going to have to stop right now because we actually have to leave this room right at 5, and there's just 1 or 2 quick things that Peter and I would like to say to you before you leave. So I'm very sorry to have to cut short, but it's a wonderful presentation, very stimulating. I think we will have a chance to ask you questions at the reception, which will just be down the hall at 5, which we'll tell you more about in just a minute.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.